How'd you like to listen to .NET Rocks with no ads? Easy. Become a patron. For just $5 a month, you get access to a private RSS feed where all the shows have no ads. $20 a month will get you that and a special .NET Rocks patron mug. Sign up now at patreon.netrocks.com. Happy New Year and welcome back to .NET Rocks, starting the year right with a Geek Out on energy. I'm Carl Franklin, that's Richard Campbell.
Howdy.
How was your Christmas?
Excellent. You know, we're now living up on the coast, so we went into town to spend days with our girls. You know, one hosting a dinner, the other one hosting a breakfast, that kind of thing. So,
and a brown bear in a pine tree,
something like that. Yeah. Yeah, we're all about the offshore wildlife these days. Where you know, lots of dolphins and sea lions and the occasional whale and the bloody river otters. Nobody told them they were river otters. They go out in the ocean and everything's fine. But they're not sea otters. That's a different creature.
So cool. So what kind of animal did you cook for Christmas dinner?
I wasn't doing the cooking either. No, we did the traditional turkey. They did a fine job of it too.
Wow.
So yeah, nice. No, it was really great.
Excellent.
Yeah. How was yours?
Mine was great as well. Family.
Get your family together.
Filet mignon. Can't complain.
You went beef, huh?
Yeah.
Did you do like the whole loin or did you do the steaks?
Nope. I did individual fillets and nice. I cooked them sous vide at 129 degrees for 2 hours and then seared them.
Yeah. Edge to edge, medium rare, right? Like perfect.
Edge to edge, medium rare. But my daughters, who are used to a good medium rare, thought it was too pink.
Right. Yeah.
Even though
they're used to that gray transition.
They're used to the gray transition, and it was kind of weird. Like they had never had it before, although it was absolutely delicious.
Yeah, nice.
So,
yeah.
There was all clean plates in the house.
Yeah, that's what you're looking for, right? Can't go wrong with that.
All right. So I guess before we get started with the Energy Geek Out, let's do Better Know Framework.
Awesome. All right, what do you got?
Well, I saw this Kickstarter, and Brian McKay sent me this in Slack, in the AppVNext Slack. It's a monogram keyboard, and the reason I think Brian sent it to me is because I had bought the monogram modular dials and buttons and switches.
Their Creative Console?
Creative Console, yeah.
Yeah.
And I had one, and I just didn't really have space for it on my desk, and I didn't really use it all that much. So he's like, well, I'll buy it off you. So, yeah.
Nice. So you experimented with it, and then you've got your own ways of working, right? Like it's very personal.
It is, yeah.
The workflows.
But if you go to monogramcc.com, you can see what they've done, the Monogram Creative Console.
Right.
Now, I saw this Kickstarter for the keyboard that they're putting out that's designed for modern creators, and it's got a modular number pad or something on the side.
Right.
And it's got a little display, and you got some customizable function keys and a knob and buttons and stuff. There's no slider per se, but it does look very, very cool.
Yeah.
And I caught them in this weird time because the Kickstarter for this keyboard ended on December 15th, and they're not selling it as a product yet.
Right.
They're fulfilling their
Kickstarters.
But
and their Kickstarter obviously went well. They 3 times their goal. So that's, I like this approach that companies that know how to make product use Kickstarter to especially test the market and get their pre-orders nailed.
Right.
So now they know, okay, well, we've got a lot size this big, like we can get the run up, tune the thing up, but presumably it's just going to be a regular product for them going forward.
Yeah, presumably. And I hope so, because I want to buy one.
Yeah.
This looks really cool.
Yeah. And I like that they, because you've seen like the all OLED keyboards, which I think is too much.
Yeah.
This is that OLED around the edges, normal keys in the middle.
Right.
It wouldn't surprise you. It almost makes sense that they might be able to stick a couple of console items onto it too, depending on what you were doing.
I mean, there's nothing worse than, having, your fingers remember, where the keys are, and then they all change from under you. Oops.
I didn't press this button or change this setting, and now I'm using a Dvorak keyboard layout.
Yeah, but and the separate keypad's great because sometimes you want a keypad on the left, not just automatically on the right. Different people, different things.
Yes.
Good one, man. Nice find.
Yeah. So let's hope it becomes product and we can talk about it later.
I'm pretty sure it will.
So what's on your mind today, Mr. Campbell?
Well, I grabbed a comment off of the last Energy Geek Out. That was 1825, about a year ago, oddly enough. It seems to be the cadence they're doing things these days. And lots of comments on that show. As is normal for Geek Outs, there's lots of conversation around them. So this comment's a year old. It's from Jasper Sigmund, who's a regular, and I believe already has a .NET Rocks mug. Might even have Music Code by, I don't know. But if you don't, Jasper, I'm going to hook you up. He says, it baffles me that with all this cutting-edge technology, because you remember last year's Energy Geek Out, I talked a lot about the new fusion stuff because there'd been a bunch of new fundraisers and stuff like that.
Right.
With all this cutting-edge technology, enormous reactors like the tokamak and gigantic lasers, that we still rely on good old water and steam to produce electricity. Isn't there any research being done on how we might not need water anymore? I'd like to think that maybe in 100 or 1,000 years, we'll have actual spaceships with warp cores like reactors, and we don't have a steam turbine attached to them to make electricity.
Okay. Clearly, he's either joking or he hasn't been paying attention to the Geek Outs because there's lots of things that don't involve water.
Well, almost everything does, right? The basic concept of we boil water to make steam is just a question of how we do it. It's a very, very, obviously solar doesn't.
Solar and wind
doesn't. But his real reference was this idea to things like a lot of the fusion reactors just don't have any plans for how to make electricity.
Right.
Although I did, in my response to him at the time, bring up the fact that the Tri-Alpha actually is capturing energy from their fusion reactions using the same coils that can create the fusion reaction. So they have a pulse reactor, and as they create enough magnetic tension to actually cause the pulse to occur, that pressure back is actually energy they can capture off their coils, which is very science fiction. That's the kind of thing you might use in space going forward, different ways to capture energy. But the other part of this is that we use a lot of steam turbines for a reason, because we know how, right? Like what we want from electricity is reliability, not innovation, really. And steam turbines are a known technology that you can get decades from, that you can price out today for a price 25 years from now. And so that's hard to compete with. That being said, steam's only good into a certain temperature range, and most traditional combustion strategies like burning coal or wood or oil, even some nuclear, fall into the temperature range where water is well suited as your power fluid, is the thing that takes in the energy and then distributes it out through turbines. But as you get to higher temperature stuff like the molten salt reactors that run much higher temperatures, or even the heliocentric collectors, where they'll use fluorine salts as the fluid, then you need to take the heat out a different way. And that's when things like supercritical carbon dioxide and ultra high temperature helium become a better mechanism for generating energy. So, we're sticking with water because let's remember, we've only been making electricity industrially for a little over 100 years, not much more. And so it's all been about reliability and technique. It's only in the past couple of decades that we've really had an option for alternatives. And so those technologies are still maturing.
There you go.
But Jasper, as usual, great comment. Thank you so much for your participation in the show. And a copy of Music Code By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music Code By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And if you comment there and I read in the show, we'll send you a copy of Music Code By.
And you can follow us on Twitter if you like. That's fine. But the cool kids are hanging out on Mastodon these days. I'm Carl Franklin at techhub.social.
And I'm Rich Campbell at mastodon.social.
Send us a toot. You might get some music to code by that way as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so where to begin with energy?
One of the things I would talk about is, we talked about this in the space show last week, that we did some of the Geek Outs, then I did that thing with NASA, and that turned into some talks, and I've been doing space talks ever since. Not that I've talked to NASA about energy, although NASA will come up today. But I've also started doing Energy Geek Out talks. And the rate of the evolution of these technologies is fairly slow. So it gets pretty boring for me. Like I'm doing space talks right now because it's super fun because every week Elon's done something, right? Like it's always some nutty thing next. But energy technologies are moving a little slower. But one of the ways it's become really fun for me is that I've been tailoring each of these talks to the country that I'm in. So, the basic conversation about the state of wind, state of solar, state of nuclear, like all of those kinds of things, they're all the same for the most part until you talk about it in the context of the country. So at NDC Porto, I talked about the way the Portuguese make electricity. So there wasn't much talk about nukes just because they don't have any. But they got great wind and they got interesting solar and they got some pumped hydro. And it's fun to watch the folks from the country hear the stories of their own power.
Yeah.
That most of the time folks don't know. And I've been keeping all those notes. So I'm building up a repertoire. I've done it in Norway, obviously in Canada, Australia. Although depending on the country, like if you're going to talk about the U.S. has one of the most complicated grids in the world, arguably the most complicated grid in the world. A, you're a first. And B, bloody big country. And it's very fragmented. Like there's something like 9 power grids in the U.S. So it's got to be kind of a state by state thing. When I did a Canadian version, I was doing it for British Columbia, which is a lot of hydroelectric. So it doesn't make sense in this context really go into the individual countries, but I've got a lot of notes around those different parts and have dove into areas. So you might hear me reference a particular country. And it is probably one where I've read all of the paperwork for that country. Because they give me insight. Like I'm reading about the Portuguese pump storage solution in the far north, which is an 800 megawatt pumped hydro. It's massive. It's incredible. It's the largest in the world. It's incredible.
Wow.
Anyway, let's start this time around with wind.
Okay.
Because wind's had an interesting year, actually.
Yeah, certainly in my neck of the woods.
It's picked up the pace. Yeah, certainly wind, is relevant in different areas. 2023 will be a record year. They're expecting over 100 gigawatts worldwide to be installed. Wind power installations slowed down during the pandemic. They are a very large scale physical thing to be done. And so they were well behind in terms of the rate of the expected installs. And so they're catching up, and the byproduct of that will be some banger years going forward. The other big trend in wind has been progressively larger and larger and larger turbines. Megawatt, 2 megawatt, 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt, 15 megawatt. Like when you're getting up to 15 megawatts, you're talking one rotation of those blades is enough power for a half a dozen houses for a year. Right? Yeah. Like it's crazy, these massive amounts of electricity being produced. And there's a question of why? Like why it gets so big? And the reality, of course, is the taller the mast is and the larger the blade span is, the more consistent the power is. And you need fewer of them. The huge number of turbines creates problems for power alignment. You have to adjust all the sine waves to match up. It's complicated to make all these things work well.
Also, you know very well that taking a little whirly bird out in the wind, it's going to go.
Yeah. Well, most light. Most wind turbines have a minimum power and a maximum power that they can take, and they'll actually turn them off if it gets too windy, which seems crazy. But think of the stresses. When you're talking about those 15 megawatts seem to be the big ones. That's a 500-foot tall mast from the surface, typically of the water, to the hub.
I would imagine that the bigger they are, the more momentum the blades have.
Right.
So they can take more wind gusts and lulls and still kind of rotate at an even.
You're exactly right. And they tend to be consistent. And the blades are, they're even bigger. That's just the hub, right? The diameter of the rotor is 775 feet. So imagine a rotating structure tip to tip that's as large as the height of the Golden Gate Bridge from the water to the top of the tower. That's how big these things are. And so in the past couple of years, all of the major turbine producers have been making larger and larger turbines, and they're all having problems, the structural problems. They're starting to come apart.
Wow.
And they've all had effectively recalls. So, and I hate to say this, but I feel like that's good news Because as long as you were racing for size, you weren't really racing for other innovations. If the correct answer to a better turbine was always a bigger turbine, then you were just trying to make it bigger. But as they got much above these 15 megawatt ones, the structural stresses in the blades got so high that the blades are breaking.
So they're finding a sweet spot.
Yeah, and so you've hit that curve where now you're going to have to make the blade stronger, aka more expensive, to get any bigger. And in the reducing the cost per megawatt, now you're on the other side of the curve. You're going to have to spend more to produce more to make a bigger turbine, and that's not worth it. And so if that size sweet spot makes sense, then now you can start to pour your R&D energy into the other things you could improve with it. And in terms of increasing reliability, better motor controls, better resistances. So there's lots of ways to continue to improve it. So it speaks to a maturing industry. But when it's just not like it's just General Electric that's having this problem. Siemens has the same problem. Vestas has the same problem. Like all of them seem to hit this wall at once. And so it seems to be a point in the industry where that's about as far as we're going to go on that.
Innovation wise, yeah.
It's for innovation on the size side.
Yeah.
We've kind of nailed onshore wind. It works. You can't go that big there. It just doesn't make sense.
Right.
Then you have different classes of offshore, and the near shore approach, which the Danes have done the most of, but it's all over the world without a doubt,
right?
Are also pretty mature. So now we're talking about real offshore. So the difference being the amount of water you're in. So up to about 50 meters of water, roughly 150 feet or so, you can slam a casement down through the water to the bottom, pump the water out, then drill a big hole into the bottom, pour concrete, and mount a mast. And that's your offshore wind, right? It's anchored to the bottom, but it's basically the same as onshore wind, just out in the water, a little further away from people. The airflow is cleaner there, so you can go larger. And a lot of these Titans, these 15 megawatt, that's the installation they're doing. The problem is that lots of places water deeper than that.
Yeah.
Here we are in British Columbia with lots of wind blowing in. We have barely any wind turbines at all. I mean, A, we have a lot of hydroelectric power, thanks mountains, very useful. But B, our water's really deep, right? Like this is fjord country.
Yeah.
And 50 meters of water is, 100 meters away. It's just, there's nowhere to put a wind turbine.
Wow.
So the technology has been maturing. And again, I'm going to reference Portugal here because I did that Portuguese talk where they have one of the experimental floating wind turbine test sites.
Floating?
Yes. Because once the water gets much deeper than 50 meters, the pressures involved to drill into the bottom are just too high.
So I'm trying to think of the physics of how that would work. I'm kind of thinking like, and this is the first I've heard of it, but I'm kind of thinking like, how a sailboat has a big keel that has, the bottom is very heavy and it sort of floats down. It goes down into the water.
You're exactly right.
And keeps it balanced.
Yeah.
So would you have the turbine mast mounted to some great big giant structure with a big weight on the bottom?
Not that big. Now we're directly borrowing from oil rig technology, and so you have maybe 150 meter tall mast, but below you have another 100 meters of lower structure, essentially in the same shape, and then it's cable stayed to the bottom.
Okay.
So you have a set of anchors with a set of lines running to it that keeps it more or less in the same area. But it is floating, so it's going to move. It's just not going to move very far, but it's also going to twist.
Yeah.
Right? But it's all, in some ways, it's going to be more survivable in rough seas because it has some give, where the fixed masts have no give.
That's right. They're going to get pummeled.
Right. And further offshore, you get more significant weather, but you also get better wind.
Yep.
And that's right. Depending on the nature of your bottom, you may be completely out of sight, which makes people happier. You can get away from the migration paths of seabirds. So the incidence of encounters with seabirds goes down. So there's a bunch of advantages. Now it's not indefinite depth. We're talking about 350 meters of water, but that's a lot more continental shelf. that you can be placing these on.
Mm-hmm. Where I live, we have Long Island Sound. So Long Island juts out from New York City out east. And then there's this little, you could think of it as a big pond, but it's a sound. And inside the sound, the wind is okay, but it's not as certainly the waves, but it's not as good as outside the sound when you're right on the Atlantic.
Yeah, but there's plenty, there's a reason for the fishing is so great in the Northeast. The water's relatively shallow. So it's easy to fish to the bottom and to that's, when you think about lobster and cod and all of those great fisheries, it's in relatively shallow water. It's still hundreds of meters, but not thousands of meters.
Right.
And so that opens a door to, this is all great wind power territory. The challenge of now you can immediately think of the challenges. This now is a mixed use thing.
Right.
Generally speaking, wind turbine operators don't want boats around their wind turbine.
That's right. Not in my backyard, not in my front yard. and forget about what it does to the lobsters and the cod, right? I mean,
it's a good question of what does it do? I mean, they're just anchors. So it's just more stuff on the bottom, which, in some ways that's artificial reef.
That's true.
I would also argue that if you make areas with wind turbines in place and you make them exclusion zones, that's a place for those animals to grow.
Right.
Right. If people stay out of them, then that's a non-fish area. And what comes out of that fish, out of those zones can then be fished. And so you might actually be strengthening the stocks in that area. But it bears study, right? It is a mixed use problem.
Right.
Although most of the time you will see fairly, let's say, dramatic conversations about this stuff.
Oh, I know a lot about that. There's a lot of talk going on in my town right now.
Yeah.
Because of wind turbines that are being assembled at the State Pier in New London, Connecticut. Little old New London, right, is in the news. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. And they've been arguing about it and going over budget and all this stuff for a few years now. But it looks like some good stuff is finally coming out of it.
So they're using the State Pier as the staging ground for building wind turbine projects.
That's right.
Around the Northeast.
Yeah. And so I think of it like the developer tool company of software, right? They're not building the turbines. They're not, or they're not having them built. They're not putting them out there and benefiting from their, what they produce.
They're not making electricity.
They're not making electricity. Exactly. They're putting them together.
Yeah. They're the place everybody has to go to if you actually want to build them out.
Right.
That's cool. And it's just building the infrastructure to make it easier to make more wind power in that part of the world.
Yeah.
All in all, it's good news. They're progressing. The cost per watt is really low. It's some of the cheapest electricity in the world. Between wind and solar are both the lowest costs. And that's one of the reasons for the increasing size. And we're learning to do better, to move it further away. Of course, further offshore still means you've got cables running to shore because electricity is for the folks on the land. So there is some complex infrastructure as you get further and further offshore. And there's plenty of water deeper than 350 meters. But we've also, again, can tap the oil rig industry because they've dealt with oil rigs at much deeper depths than that if we want to go deeper still. But at this point, the 350 meter range seems to be, there's a bunch of test projects in place today, half a dozen of them in the world. They are working well. Learnings are occurring. So I think you're going to see a big expansion there. And depending on the nature of your water, that might be fully offshore, not visible at all from land, or maybe just further away. But certainly titanically large, massive turbines, but in very steady winds, so they generate electricity in a long period of time.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to solar?
Sure.
Why not? Let's talk a little bit of solar. So,
can I tell you a solar story before we start?
Yeah, tell me your solar story.
So, a couple of years ago, so I have this huge house that my wife and I bought this house when we both had kids living with us. And so she has 2 and I have 2, and we needed a place that had a lot of bedrooms and a lot of size and, whatever. So we bought this house. Of course, now they're all moved out and we're like, we don't like this house anymore. It's too big, right?
Join the club, man.
Yeah, but it was built in 1989. The roof was, 20 years old or something like that. It needed a new roof. The roof was getting angry. It was throwing shingles at us.
Nice.
Yeah. It was like, hey. It's like, grandma's teeth are falling out kind of thing, right? So we put on a new roof a couple of years ago. And now that we have this new roof, we were like, well, let's see about our solar panel options because, we have a pretty high carbon footprint here. We have, HVAC systems and, lots of computers.
But your power bill is substantial.
The power bill in the summer gets ridiculous, especially the hotter it gets. Yeah. So we looked into it, and what we went with was this company called Trinity Solar. They're a Connecticut company. And the way we wanted to structure it was perfect. They basically, for no money down. Yeah,
heard that one.
Yeah. So for no money down, they come out, they do an inspection. They're also a roofing company. So if there's any structural things that need reinforced.
Yeah, the two go together really well. Yeah.
Yeah, they do that for you. And they make any repairs.
Plus you may need a new, it makes sense to do it when you're putting a new roof on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we already had the roof. Okay. So there was a few things that needed some more support in the attic, and they did that free of charge. And then they put on the panels. And so there's a tax incentive if you buy panels, right?
Right.
If I go out and buy my own solar panels and hire an independent contractor to put them up, I get a tax discount on that. I get a rebate.
Right.
But these guys are different. They're saying, all right, we're going to own the panels. We're going to put up the panels, and they're ours. We're going to give you a lease at a fixed rate per month. That's lower than your electricity bill. And by the way, they told us that you're getting a full inverter's worth of panels, whatever it was, 36 panels, I think it was.
Right.
And, if you add just one more, you'd need another inverter. So It was like, you're going to be covered. Your bills, based on what our bills were in the past, this is enough to cover the bill. So we're basically trading, the way I looked at it is, we're trading a bill that can go from $100 a month to $800 a month, $900 a month.
Right.
Depending on the season, to, $250 a month. Every month for 20 years.
Right.
And so there was a bit of discussion and all that stuff. And it just kind of occurred to me that, having a known amount is better, especially today with the power companies upping their delivery charge, which boggles my mind why you have an electricity charge. Oh, and by the way, we're going to even charge you more to get that power to you. Oh, and by the way, we can just change that whenever we feel like it.
Well, that's why they invented that charge, because the power rate was fixed by the government, right? And so they came up with new charges that aren't part of that agreement.
And so in December, there was some rumors going around that they were going to, this is Connecticut Light and Power, Eversource it's called now. They're going to double their rates. And they did. In January this year, the rate doubled. So what was a $200 monthly bill is now a $400 monthly bill.
Right.
And we got turned on in June. And since then, it's all coming back. So and then there was also the question of, well, what happens if you want to sell your house and the new owners don't want the solar? And I'm like, well, they won't buy the house.
It's okay.
Go away.
Yeah. It's part of the deal.
It's part of the deal.
Oh, I want the house, but I don't want the garage.
Yeah. What? Take that garage off, will you? You can have it. It's fine. So, and the Trinity was basically like, yep, whoever buys the house, the lease goes over into their name. We transfer it, and Bob's your uncle. So it seemed like a no-brainer to me, especially because, it's not like we're aging, but, retirement is 10, 15, 20 years away. I don't know, whatever it is. And
I don't know.
Yeah, what is this thing you call retirement? I don't know.
Yeah.
But, at that point, we could sell the house and, add the however many thousands of dollars onto the value by having those solar panels.
Yeah, really, you're selling your house with a known cost of electricity.
Right.
Which is useful.
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we did that.
Yeah, it's cool.
Anyway, that's my story.
The first time a whole gigawatt of solar cells was installed in the world was only in 2004. I mean, solar power has been around since the 70s. It's just really expensive.
Wow.
Right? But only 20 years ago did we started having build outs like that, like a gigawatt of electricity. But that wasn't even one site. That was all over the world. 2023, it's a gigawatt a day. We've over 360 gigawatts of solar was added worldwide in 2023. And I just give that as a sense of scale that what's happened. Solar panels have gotten substantially less expensive.
Yeah.
And you can largely thank the Chinese for that. They're the ones who really did mass manufacture. They didn't invent them. They are very much an American design. They're about 22% efficient, but they're very cost controlled. They work really reliably. Of those 365 gigawatts of electricity capacity added last year, 25% of that is, like you, residential solar. Most of it is commercial. That is large scale farms, essentially fields of solar panels, and they're very, very inexpensive. It's the least expensive power to deploy in this day and age. And I could do the MCOSTs and all those other calculations, but it's not that important, right? Like we can leave off the math today. We'd have to go that far into that particular thing. But it's an interesting point to see that solar is not being installed because of because it's the right thing to do. It's like zero carbon energy. It's being done because it's the least expensive energy,
right?
And so the straight motivations are there. That being said, it's getting more innovative. They are doing fun things with solar in the sense they're doing things we talked about this last year: photovoltaics, solar panels on reservoirs.
I see applications for this in my own town, and I wonder, hey, is anybody paying attention? I know they don't listen to .NET Rocks, but this isn't something that we invented or you invented. This is being done, especially on channels and waterways.
Irrigation.
Waterways that aren't usually used by people.
Well, where you're seeing this push towards photovoltaics is on waterways where they're currently managing problems caused by sunlight hitting the water. Right? Because one of the challenges of photovoltaics is you're going to darken the water, so you will modify an ecosystem. But if it's an irrigation canal, right now you're trying to scrape algae out of it. So covering it with solar panels actually decreases that work.
And by now you probably figured out, if you don't know what photovoltaics is putting solar panels on floating structures, rafts, barges, whatever you want to call them.
Or at least over water.
And over water. It prevents rapid evaporation. And it does a few things, and you obviously get the solar energy from it.
Yeah, so you're generating solar power. You're decreasing the amount of sunlight hitting the water, which helps with algae management and other inappropriate growth when you're talking about canals and irrigation. And you're keeping the solar panels cool. Solar panels don't actually like too much heat, and they actually get less efficient and wear out. So the side effect of slowing down the rate of evaporation is also keeping the panels cooler. So it is mutually beneficial in a lot of respects. That being said, it's not as cheap as conventional commercial, because conventional commercial is row on row, very symmetrical. Wiring is trivial. Maintenance is the easiest possible. And you're always optimizing pointing directions. Although in the Northern Hemisphere, we're not pointing as much solar to the south anymore. We're pointing it more east and west because we generate too much power at midday. So we'd rather use our panels less efficiently per panel to distribute the power over a larger range of time. Collect more light in the morning on the east face panels and more light in the later part of the day on the west face panels. You don't need as many panels facing south. It's funny.
It is funny,
but it's kind of where we're at now because the panels are as cheap as they are. And there once was a time when it made sense to have helio tracking solar panels. So solar panels en masse with motors, because the panels were so expensive that optimizing their collection at all times was worth it in exchange for motors that need constant maintenance, right? That need repairs and those sorts of things. And now largely that's gone away because the panels have gotten so cheap. It's cheaper to just put in more panels aimed in all the directions you need to aim them in. And that's one of the challenges when you talk about photovoltaics is often the panels are not pointed in ideal directions. They're following the path of the irrigation canal, or they're just wherever it'll fit in the reservoir. But that's okay because it's power it still makes net power. It's power you wouldn't otherwise have. It has benefits to the reservoir that it's on. Another area, a specialized area in solar related to this is agrivoltaics, or solar panels on farms that are still working. So this is nothing magical. Imagine instead of them being down low to the ground, they're 10 feet up, so that they're on posts essentially that have lifted them up so that the ground below it is accessible.
Oh, I see. I was wondering. Yeah, you said these are working farms, so
yeah,
I was thinking fallow farms, or those that aren't working as much anymore. That's a good use for them. But I guess you're right. I mean, you could put them on poles and posts and lift them up
and raise them up. Now, you are shading that area, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are many agricultural plants that prefer more shade. Many of the animal feed grasses prefer more shade. So a mixed use where you have agricultural animals who prefer the shade also under those panels, being able to eat and maintain that grass. So you're making electricity above, feeding your animals below.
And if you're spacing them out correctly, you will have sunlight.
You'll have some, yeah.
As the sun moves.
Plus, we've all the increasing amount of environmental change means that many of these fields are too hot as it is.
Yeah, and
so increasing amount of shade on them is useful.
It's a good idea.
So yeah, it's an easy one, and it's a way for the same way more farmers are throwing a few wind turbines around as well. Is another source of income for agriculture. And then it also can benefit the ground that it's covering.
So what if you have, let's say, a 4-acre plot and you're not farming your land? Does it make sense to put a solar farm on those 3 acres?
Quite possibly, yes. But and now you're a commercial producer.
What are you going to do with all that power?
You have to negotiate with the power grid.
Yeah.
Right? So you now becoming a provider to the power grid, and so it's all in the agreement you're going to make with them about buying the power and what they're expecting from you.
So I remember in our very first Geek Out, the electricity Geek Out. Was it the electricity Geek Out, the first one? No, it wasn't.
No, the first ones were space, but...
Yeah, space, the shuttle. Okay. But I remember in that electricity Geek Out that you did, you dispelled the myth that the meter doesn't run backwards when you overproduce, right? If you produce more than you...
Well, we were talking about... The meter does run backwards. But is that power actually...
But the electricity doesn't flow backwards.
Yeah. Is the power actually usable? Most of the time, no.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's when we're talking about residential solar, where we're talking about a couple of kilowatts and it's already been stepped all the way down to retail power to 120 volts AC.
Yeah.
When you talk about commercial power plants like that, commercial solar, they're delivering the power to the grid at a much higher level.
Okay.
Right. Because you have to protect people from that. You can't have that on the side of someone's house.
Right.
Right. So right now, the way that residential solar is set up, it's designed for you to consume.
Yeah.
And when you produce more than needed, it's metered by the power company largely as a credit to you, so that when you do need to buy power from them when the solar isn't running, it doesn't cost you anything. Right. And that's no power company willingly enters into that. It's very much a political conversation, but it's to encourage more solar to be installed.
Okay.
And it's worth it for the most part because it does turn off older power plants. Like it works out. Is that power actually usable? Most of the time, no. It's very hard to take stepped down power and distribute it to other homes. Right? It's not water and it doesn't flow easily uphill.
Yeah.
But when if you're talking your farm scenario, 3 acres, you're going to lay down a bunch of panels. Now you're going to be a small producer, but they're not going to put residential power to that.
Right.
They're going to bring commercial power in for that. They're going to ask you for 3-phase power.
Right.
They're going to ask for it at 480, right? In a form that is more easily added to the grid for other places to use.
Right.
Right. And that's the distinction. That's not how houses are set up.
Right. And so, as you said, this isn't something that you can just go online and choose, hey, how many acres do you have? Okay, here's how much money you're going to make every month. You have to negotiate that with the power company.
Yeah. It depends on the power company. Some power companies are well set up for. So you want to be a micro producer. Like, here's the deal. But it depends on you. It's a case by case basis, right? Mm-hmm. And the site matters too,
right?
When are you going to make power? How much is it going to be? They may even say, hey, we're going to pay far less for power at noon when we have way too much.
Right.
We'd rather you set up your panels facing east and west and generate less power midday, more power early, and we'll pay you more for that. Like, you're going to have to look at the deal for your area for it to make sense.
It's interesting. It's really interesting, and it's something that I would never even have thought of.
Yeah.
Even last year.
We are evolving, aren't we? Like, we're understanding more about this, and so are the power companies. The power companies are pretty basic. Most people listening to this show, and certainly you and I are, we are internet children. Like, we've been around the internet our whole lives, and we think peer-to-peer is not a big deal. But outside of our industry, it's bizarre. And power companies are like that. They have spent a long time to come to a place to be able to deal with a large number of power producers, right? For a long time, the grid was built around a handful of very large power plants distributed over a wide area.
Right.
And that has evolved with our need to change the way we produce power into many more smaller producers and being able to integrate and modify that power efficiently.
Very good.
When I put out the word about writing the Geek Outs, of course, I got questions from our regular listeners. Martin Thwaites asked about solar efficiencies. Like, why are we still stuck at 22%? And the reason really is cost. Yeah. We are developing, there's certainly experiments with more efficient panels, perovskite panels being one of the most obvious examples. They get up into the 30s. The downside is reliability and cost. So when you're starting to experiment with these more higher density panels, they have heat problems. They wear out quickly. And so, the power, the advantage of that 22 of these classic silicon dioxide panels is that they are reliable and they last. And we are learning to recycle them. So in the past couple of years, we've seen some good breakthroughs. I read through a bunch of paperwork from a company called Solar Cycle in Texas, who are building the machinery to automate the processing of classic aluminum solar panels.
Wow.
So they strip the aluminum housings off, and then they actually have, because these different layers that go into making a solar panel are all glued together, they're very tricky to separate. And recycling of each one of them each layer is a different process, and you don't want to cross-contaminate it. So they've been developing the machines that neatly cut the glass off the top so that glass can be recycled, and neatly separate each of the different layers in the panel into the constituent ingredients so they can be resold.
Richard, whatever happened to graphene? Remember, we were so excited about graphene, and particularly about solar panels.
Well, we're anything electrical was interesting. What happened to graphene is that all of that hype that we were talking about a few years ago led to funding. And when scientists are funding, what do they talk about? Nothing, because they have money. They're at work.
Okay.
So graphite technologies are being developed. It's just that it's hard. Scientists only talk about stuff when they're trying to raise money to work on it.
But have there been any products? I mean, I have seen there is.
It's a couple of graphene batteries and things like that.
Well, I've seen graphene solar panels that claim to have raised the efficiency by 20 to 40%.
Yeah, but never got out of the lab.
Okay.
Right? Like, they test them and then they have problems, right? They're too expensive to manufacture. It's like, this thing's twice as power efficient, but costs 10 times as much. Oh boy, right? Oh, and it lasts only 2 years. Like, these are the problems. There's a difference between the science of a new material and turning it into an engineered product that people can use. So then the benefits of, obviously, of recycling solar panels is that we're making tons of them, and they do wear out, right? Over time, you get about 20 years, 25 years, they lose about a third to 0.5% per year in efficiency. So at some point, it's just worth it to replace them. And you can't just keep throwing them in the dump. You want those materials back. There's an expectation that by 2030, we're going to have to decommission somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 million tons of solar panels.
Wow.
And so recycling is going to be a big deal. And, a few decades on, it's going to be tens of millions, hundreds of millions of tons. So, and right now it's cheap to dump them. throw them away. It's expensive to recycle them. And so maturing recycling technology is important. That's where a company like SolarCycle comes into play. Is they're learning to recycle solar panels.
That's very cool.
And make the tools to make it easier for other people to do it. So we're big on this closed cycle system where you build things to make electricity and then you're able to reprocess them to make more things. And the metals they can extract from that can be turned back into new solar panels again. So it's good news and certainly improvements.
Cool.
All right, let's take a break.
All right, we will do that. And we'll be back after these important messages. Stick around. And we're back. It's .NET Rocks Geek Out Edition, first of 2024. I'm Carl Franklin. That's Richard Campbell. We're talking energy. We started with wind. We did solar. And now we're on to...
Well, I feel like we got to talk about power storage because we just talked about the two intermittent power sources.
Yeah.
And so, there's a reason they're cheap. They don't run all the time.
Right.
And
you have to do something with all that energy. Use it or lose it.
Well, and that's always the case with anything. But we talk about baseload power generation. And that can run, we can control exactly how much it makes at any given time, whether that be hydroelectric or oil, gas, you name it. With wind and solar, yeah. You could stop wind just by locking the turbines, but why would you? But when when you're making more energy than necessary, you got to do something with it. And storing it's useful because there's lots of time when it's not working.
Right.
For better or worse, Tesla, broke a lot of ground here. They're reducing the cost of making high density batteries.
Right.
And their battery innovation led to them doing a lot of the some original grid scale power placements. And I've talked about this on previous shows. You can go back and listen to them. I'm trying to cover new ground here.
Yeah.
Last year, I was talking about Form Energy. So these are ex-Tesla guys who recognize that the lithium-ion battery is not a good battery for grid. Lithium-ion batteries are good batteries for cars. They pack a lot of power in low weight because you need to move, good in laptops too.
Yeah.
But pack a lot of power in a low weight environment that charges quickly and also can discharge quickly. You think about how quickly an electric car can discharge its battery. Yeah. And that's that whole effect. And that's not what the grid needs.
Right.
The grid wants lots of power. It doesn't need to move it around physically, like it can stay stuck to the ground and lasts a long time. And so what Form Air was focused on was a type of battery called the iron air battery. This battery's been around a long time. NASA had experimented with a bunch of them for space-related technologies back in the time. But the big difference with the iron air battery is that it's got a long discharge cycle. So sort of natural discharge rates for lithium-ion, lithium phosphate batteries are in the 6 to 8 hour range. So, if you try and draw them faster than that, the battery overheats. If you try and do them real slowly, they leak energy anyway. And so you can't get much outside of that time range. The natural discharge time for a iron air battery is 100 hours.
Wow.
So
that's good for storage.
For grid.
Yeah, for grid.
So they are bigger, they are heavier, and they are hotter than lithium-ion batteries. None of which is a problem when you're on the grid. What they also are is cheap.
Ooh.
Because the materials are less expensive. So a less expensive, bigger, heavier, hotter battery that you can stick behind a fence and can naturally discharge over many days. So in terms of filling in the grid, it's great. The work that Elon did and Tesla did down in Australia with their big lithium-ion, the megapacks in Victoria, those were bridging power. So they weren't designed to last a long time. What they were designed to do is provide, when they needed to switch between solar and wind sources, they needed power in between those two that just lasted for a few minutes. And without it, they were having brownout problems where one power source was starting to fade. They'd have instabilities in electricity, which made people sad. Then they get the other systems back up and it'd be fine. So these battery packs sat in between those two to take care of that problem. Not a bad use for lithium-ion batteries.
So back to my story of solar panels. These guys, Trinity, which is a Connecticut company. And by the way, if anybody is listening in Connecticut and wants to get Trinity to come and look at you, contact me because I get a kickback. Yes. Okay, anyway. So they do offer a battery option, but we have a propane generator.
Right.
And a 500-gallon propane tank in the backyard. And it doesn't make any sense for us to have that. Now, and some people, when I mentioned it on Facebook, some people said, I want the battery pack so I can be completely off the grid, right? They just they don't want to deal with the power company. They don't want the power company to benefit from my generated power. And, so there is that. But I don't care about that. I care about a low monthly bill.
Yep.
And I don't want to, if the power goes out,
you have power.
2 weeks worth of power in that propane tank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's compelling, right? And just, you have to store that fuel, right? And it does age, like you have to use it up eventually, and it costs a certain amount to refill. And the machine takes maintenance. Batteries are pretty stable, although they do wear out. They don't have any maintenance.
And also these guys told us they wouldn't last that long. Like you wouldn't get, you wouldn't get days and days.
No.
Out of
well, it takes and again, it's the natural discharge cycle. You have to have a lot more packs if you want to increase duration.
Right.
And that, that's the claim to fame for Form Air. When we talked about them a year ago, they were in the prototype stage. They were putting their initial project in. It was supposed to be finished this year, 1 megawatt project in Minnesota. That has been completed. So they actually delivered on time and it worked. And Minnesota's response to that was to buy a bigger one.
Wow, great.
So yeah, so many times they say, we're going to have our first test project in 2023 and it's just never done. And in fact, I'll bring up a few of these along the way of other technologies because that's what's happened to them.
Now this is the lithium ion batteries.
No, these are iron air batteries.
These are iron air batteries. Yeah. Oh, so, wow.
Form Energy, when we talked about a year ago, they said next year we're going to have this first prototype project in Minnesota.
All right.
They did it. It worked. That was a 1 megawatt pack, so 150 megawatt hours. Again, remember that 100-watt discharge thing?
Yeah.
So a much higher megawatt hour than the actual power. It can only put out 1 megawatt, but it could do it for 150 hours.
Wow.
So yeah, Minnesota's now asked for a 10 megawatt, 1,000 megawatt hour implementation.
Jeez.
And so is Colorado. And the next one to be finished, and then after that is Georgia's asked for an even bigger one, a 15 megawatt, 1,500 megawatt hour.
Now, what's the reason that they want these? Is it because they want to avoid brownouts or something? Or
Therein lies the question, like, what are you using it for?
Yeah.
And so it is exactly that. They have intermittent power sources, like wind and solar, and they need to provide power all the time. So what's the alternative to wind and solar? What's the normal? What do you light up when the sun goes down?
Right.
The normal thing is a natural gas peaker plant. Natural gas peaker plants are very efficient power plants. They're great because they take the natural gas, they burn it in a turbine, which spins a generator, and then the output heat boils water to spin a steam turbine as well. So they extract energy multiple times from that propane.
Pretty cool.
Or that natural gas.
Yeah.
They're compact, they're quick to build, and they're efficient. And they're called peaker plant. The peaker plant model, which is a particular configuration, can be lit up in minutes.
Wow.
So as the solar, as the sun's starting to go down, you light up this power plant. But they are carbon emitting, although they are the lowest carbon per megawatt hour electricity of the petrochemical. Now that's just like, I'm the least poisonous of these apples, but that's what normally happens, right? Is you would use a gas peaker plant, and these look to be that replacement. So they have more than enough power to last a couple of days until there's enough solar.
Yeah.
So that's the trend there, and Form Energy, more power to them. These are $100 million projects. They're not incredibly costly in the world of energy technologies. So they're having some success. It's just going to take time to scale. The government, there are other countries, there are other places that are ordering these things. They run roughly 10% the price of the equivalent lithium ion.
Wow.
So cheap.
Yeah.
But improvement. That being said, I don't think that's the best news in power storage this year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. My favorite story in 2023 actually comes out of the Australian National University. So they did a pumped hydro storage study worldwide.
Wait, I heard about this. And it might have been something that we even talked about.
Well, I certainly was excited about it.
Or I saw it on TV or something. I don't know what I said. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, what they did, they started in Australia and they ended up going all over the world because we have such good maps now. But the essential idea was this. Pump storage, there's a bunch of it that exists today. In fact, many existing hydroelectric dams are also adding pump storage to them as well, which means there's at times when they have excess electricity, which we never used to have, right? And only until grid scale solar and wind came along, extra electricity was not a thing.
Yeah.
If you were making more power than you need, you turned it down. You turned off the plant, right? But as more excess of power has been appearing on the grid, ways to store it have become more relevant. And so the idea that, hey, we're making too much power from solar right now, so pump the water back into the dam as a way to store that energy, knowing that when you need it, you can now let it back down through a turbine to generate electricity.
Okay.
That's
that wasn't the thing that I heard about. I heard about hot sand, heating up sand and using that to store energy because the sand holds on to heat longer.
Yeah.
And then using that when you have, when you need. Yeah.
Alternative energy storage. Yeah. And there's lots of experiments in there. There's the crane system and so forth. Here's the advantage of pump hydro. Totally known technology.
Right.
Hundreds of years of use, right? Like this is one of your very first ways to generate electricity. The Niagara Electric Project.
Waterfalls, capture it.
Right? Niagara Falls, Westinghouse. This is the Westinghouse Edison duel back in the 1800s. And in fact, it's not just that it was a good thing to make electricity from it. It also decreased erosion at the falls by diverting a bunch of that water down these tunnels to make electricity. They cut back the erosion rate of the falls, right? Like we always think about power generation as destructive to the environment, but often if we do it well, we're benefiting our environment too.
Yeah.
Controlling damage. And so pumped hydro is a very known technology. We know how to do it. The challenge, of course, is that if you always connect it with hydroelectric, you need something rare. And what's rare is a water source at altitude that then has a location substantially lower to it nearby. A place with a waterfall, essentially, that has enough water to make it worthwhile to fill up that area behind it as a reservoir and then let it out under control to generate electricity. And pumped hydro doesn't require that. The only thing you need to make pumped hydro work is a water source at the bottom of the hill. So a big enough river is
pool,
enough.
Something.
Right? And so then you need a hill. And at the top of the hill, you can construct a reservoir.
Right.
So you're going to alter the environment to build that reservoir. But there might not be anything there that's important. And you'll throw some solar panels on top of it when you're done. It's a dedicated reservoir.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be a major ecology. And then you drill a couple of pipes between the water at the bottom and the reservoir at the top. And when you have excess energy, you pump that water up. And when you need that energy, you let the water fall back down. So what the Australian research study showed is that there are almost 600,000 sites worldwide where this would work.
Wow.
There's in most parts of the world, there is more than enough locations for pumped hydro for world demand. Different parts of the world have more, right? The Canadians and the Melanesians are off the scale. We have so much. We have a lot of water down below and lots of hills. But all of the Western world has plenty. Northern Europe has the least. The mountain ranges are relatively small relative to where their water is. Most of Africa, plenty. Certainly Australia, plenty. Most of Asia, plenty.
Wow. That's good news.
And so their point was, here's a technology we know can last for a century with proper maintenance. We know the costs of implementing it. And it will store electricity for you efficiently in very known form, which is really what the energy industry wants.
Yeah.
My problem with any of these battery technologies is nobody knows what they'll look like in 20 years, really.
Right.
We just haven't run them that long. But we've run pumped hydro that long and longer. So the point we're saying was the amount of altitude difference available in most of these countries with water is sufficient for the power storage needed for those countries.
Wow, that's great. That's such good news.
We've always argued about this idea that it's always going to be this huge area of mixed use. And it's like, in a lot of cases, wind, solar, and pumped hydro can solve the problem. I'll include the links to the papers for folks who want to read it. It was just stunning how effective it is. And just this recognition of, as long as you've got a bottle of water below and a hill above, you make this work.
Yeah.
And back in Portugal, that 800 megawatt pumped hydro facility was just astonishing. I mean, that is grid scale power just by storing water. Yeah, and it fills that reservoir with solar and wind.
Amazing.
And land-based wind. All right. You want to talk a little hydrogen?
Let's talk hydrogen.
Okay. I mean, people always
Where's my hydrogen car, man?
Yeah. It's not, fuel cells are too expensive. Thanks for playing. Yeah. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. It's just like, listen, fuel cells can only get so cheap. Hydrogen, while a very quote unquote clean energy, is very difficult to store and it's expensive to make.
Yeah.
So right now, commercial price for hydrogen is roughly $5 a kilo or $5,000 per metric ton. Now, how do you make hydrogen? Because hydrogen doesn't like being on its own. It doesn't like being lonely. It always finds some friends.
You have to use electricity to split water, don't you?
Well, you don't have. You have to do some electricity, but today, if you want to buy commercial hydrogen, you're not going to get it from water. You're going to get it from methane.
Okay.
You're going to use steam reformation, which is high temperature steam that blows the hydrogen off, and then it produces a bunch of carbon dioxide. So if you steam reformation, the number one way to make hydrogen today is for every ton of hydrogen, you make 9 to 12 tons of carbon dioxide and consume about 6 megawatt hours of electricity.
Well, so that's not good.
No.
We don't want to make more carbon dioxide, do we?
Exactly. But it's the cheapest way to make hydrogen right now. That's your $5,000 a ton. Costs you about $5,000, but you're going to make 10 tons of carbon dioxide in the process and consume 6 megawatts of electricity for your $5,000.
No bueno.
The Germans developed a system called methane pyrolysis. Now that turns the temperature up much higher. So instead of 6 megawatt hours of electricity, you're talking 25 megawatt hours of electricity, about 4 times more than steam reformation. But the byproduct of that is solid carbon, graphite. So no CO2. You've blown the oxygen off as well.
Right.
And you can store that carbon or resell it. But the bottom line is it's not going into the environment.
Right.
It just costs more.
Until you burn it.
Right. Well, I don't know how carbon you don't normally burn. You would that's a lot of pencils, but
Yeah, it's a lot of pencils.
You make it into things. At the minimum, you bury it. The electrolysis approach, the one you mentioned off the bat with electricity,
right?
You take, now you're just taking pure air or pure water.
Yep.
You're making a ton of hydrogen. You're going to also make 8 tons of oxygen for 60 megawatt hours of electricity. So 10 times more energy than what it took to do it with steam pyrolysis.
But it's expensive, isn't it?
It's just a lot of electricity.
Yeah.
Right. And really a lot. Like, that's a lot of electricity.
Right.
And by the way, what can you do with that 1 ton of hydrogen? Right? The most efficient mechanism we have to use that hydrogen to make electricity is the fuel cell model. Right. So now you're going to recombine it with oxygen to make it back into water. And you're going to get about 3.3 megawatt hours of electricity out of that 1 ton of hydrogen. So about half the amount of energy that it costs to make that hydrogen from steam, or 13% of the amount of energy it took to make it with pyrolysis, or 5% of what it would take to make it with electrolysis. But that's fine. We always have an overhead. It takes energy to find oil. It takes energy to mine oil. It takes energy to move oil. It takes energy to refine oil. It takes energy to get that refined product into your vehicle for you to use it, right? Yes, there are always overheads in energy to producing other energy sources. The question is, can you store the hydrogen well? Can you take it where you need to go? Which, by the way, all of those things that's very hard, right? The math is not on hydrogen's side unless we're making electricity very, very cheaply. You don't use hydrogen to make electricity. You use it when you want to move it around, right? You put it in a vehicle, or you take things that that would normally be polluting and make them non-polluting.
What about making the hydrogen on site so it doesn't have to move?
That's a great point. And also making it with electricity that would otherwise be wasted.
Right. Like solar panels.
So back to our modern energy economy, right? Our modern energy economy has excess energy available.
Right.
And that's where these strategies can occasionally be useful. And it is happening. So in the Netherlands, there is a hospital called the Rijnstad East, or the Eastern State Hospital.
Okay.
And they have a hydrogen electrolysis facility built into the hospital. So they have a bunch of solar panels and wind. And so when they have excess energy, which they often do, they electrolyze water into hydrogen and oxygen. And they use both. Remember that hospitals need oxygen.
They do.
So rather than using energy to bring oxygen to the hospital, they're producing that 8 parts oxygen to 1 part hydrogen and using that oxygen in the hospital. And then when they build up enough hydrogen, they run a fuel cell to provide electricity into the hospital. So expensive, yes, relatively speaking. Non-emitting.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you think of all the carbon emissions they're taking off the table by producing their own oxygen for the hospital and by taking that excess energy they don't need that's being produced during the day and then you burning it and then using it as hydrogen to make electricity at night.
Yeah.
So to me, this is very appealing. It's the in-between part. It's not grid scale.
Right.
And it's not residential scale. It's institution scale.
But we kind of like that, especially when we talk about nuclear, which I believe is the last thing you want to talk about. But
I'm going to
maybe
we'll get there.
Talk about those little plants. I mean, I can sort of see where this is going, a distributed grid kind of thing rather than a centralized grid.
Yes, you're exactly right. As the energy industry has learned to deal with more distribution, these opportunities open up. And so the idea that a hospital plant, when hospitals have an infrastructure plant, they're feeding a bunch of needs for the hospital out of using excess energy to supply all of that as well as power.
Yep, it's good stuff. We have maybe about an hour left.
I think you're probably right.
So let's take a second break here. Yeah, it's going to be a long one, folks. So buckle up and we'll be right back after these important messages. And we're back again. It's .NET Rocks Geek Out edition.
You're not unhappy it's long, right? I mean, I'm talking to you as much as I'm talking to the listener. It's like...
No, this is great. I miss this. I totally miss this. And, everybody's down for vacation for a little bit in the wintertime. And what better way to spend it than with Carl and Richard geeking out over some energy? We
got to talk about geothermal.
Okay.
So last year's big story on geothermal was the microwave drilling technique. Do you remember it?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
It's very energy intensive, but rather than
remind us
using a bit to grind the rock, and then you have to put steel sleeves in to support the rock, and you need pump mud and all this technology, all from the oil industry. They came up with this high-powered microwave magnetron that literally vaporized the rock into gas, and then that gas adheres to the walls to reinforce it. It's totally space age, and it's still in development. I'm not going to talk about it any more than that.
Okay.
The new innovations in geothermal aren't that sci-fi.
Okay.
They're actually adopting shale extraction technology,
like fracking.
The reason that yes. The reason that the U.S. is now a leader in oil production in the world is these innovations in shale extraction, or what mostly horizontal drilling. So the trick with shale extraction, if you ever get into it, I don't recommend you do, is that they don't do the traditional drill down to the oil bed. They've already done that. Most of the time, the beds have already been drilled.
Right.
Now you're trying to get more oil from it. And so instead, what you do is you drill beside the bed, and then you turn the drill bit horizontal and come into it from the side. And then you frack it. You put an expansion material into it to break loose more, typically lots of natural gas and some oil back up the old lines.
Fracture.
Fracking is fracturing rock.
Yeah.
But that set of techniques work very well for generating geothermal power. So geothermal power is based on this idea that the deeper you drill down, the hotter the rock gets. The problem is that the drilling is the expensive part. The plant is awesome. It's small, right? You're basically pumping water down that pipe where it gets superheated by the rock down there. It comes flying back up another pipe and spins a turbine. And then you cool the water back down and you pump it again. Almost no emissions at all. It's a complete closed loop system. Like you want this everywhere. It's one of the tidiest plants you can possibly make. It's just the problem with geothermal is the drilling is expensive, and the far longer you have to drill, the more it costs. And the drill sites don't always keep working. Every time you're slamming water down there, you're shocking the rock.
Right.
And sometimes the water doesn't come back up.
Yeah, and I think I talked about this on at least one of the energy Geek Outs, but my uncle has a geothermal system, but it's not really to heat as much as it is to equalize.
Yeah.
Yeah, the average temperature, just below
6 feet.
The surface, 6 feet, is constant. And it's something like, 55, 60 degrees generally. And so when it's above that, you're going to get cooler air, and you blow a fan across the pipe and you can cool your house with it without air conditioning. And when it's cold, you can warm up your house.
Right. And I mean, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about drilling down miles.
Right.
So that we get to 400 degree rock.
Yeah. I'm just talking about a heat pump.
Yeah.
You're talking about heat.
I'm talking about making electricity by superheated steam that spins turbines. And so you need a lot of heat. And that's why it's violent, right? When that water hits that rock, it's shocking. But the fracking industry knows a lot about shocking rock because they were doing it deliberately to do oil extraction. And that's one of the reasons for these horizontal drilling effects, is that it gives them an ability to poke into a hot body in an efficient way and be able to slam water into there in a less destructive form and still use the existing vertical pipes to pick up the steam. Yeah. So they've been experimenting with these combinations in Nevada and in Utah.
Wow.
And from scratch, from a bare piece of land with a permit to build a plant, 6 to 12 weeks.
Huh.
And again, this is all out of the fracking, because fracking is quick, right? That was what it was about. They've matured these technologies for fracking, and now they can make geothermal power with them. So the initial pilot plant in Nevada, just over the past couple of years, is now producing 3.5 megawatts of electricity. 24 hours a day, dude. This is base load power.
So wait a minute now. So you're saying that once they get down to where the heat is, then they go sideways? And
yes. So they drilled down 8,000 feet in Nevada.
Yeah.
And then they turn sideways for 3,000 feet to enter the body on the side.
So now you have a 3,000 foot heat coil, basically,
right? Then they have other holes on the other side of the body where the steam's going to come out.
Yeah.
And they fire the water down there and it comes up.
Jeez.
And it'll work almost anywhere.
So what is the benefit of having that long horizontal pipe over just having a pipe at one place?
Well, you always have multiple pipes because you want to go down one side and up the other side. The horizontal pipe picks up the heat more efficiently and slower.
I see.
So you have less shock effects.
Yeah, I wasn't grokking that.
Yeah.
I get it now, because, when you go down and then immediately back up, it's only that little bubble on the bottom that heats up.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so this ability to come in low on the hot body with the other pipes above it, it's just more efficient.
It makes total sense now.
And I just want you to get the idea. There's a bunch of different techniques they've learned from fracking. They're incorporating together to make power anywhere they can get to the hot rock. It's just a question of how far you have to drill down. The deeper it gets, the more expensive it gets.
Sure.
But 8,000 feet is not that shallow. So the Nevada plant works. So there's a plant being developed in Utah for 400 megawatts. It's supposed to be online by 2026. And guess who's funding it?
Oh, no.
Google.
Oh, I didn't expect that.
Alphabet, like Microsoft and most tech companies, need a lot of electricity.
Yeah.
They're building cloud data centers.
Right.
And they've made a commitment, one would call it greenwashing, to zero emission energy.
Yeah.
And this is an approach to solving that particular problem. Dmitry Faleev, one of our listeners, asked me about the energy being consumed by artificial intelligence technologies, large language models and the like. Yeah. And those are all running in these cloud data centers. And in some ways, I would say, it's a lot of energy. I mean, at least it's going to better purpose than NFTs. But the fact that it's a handful of companies that are hosting these things, and we can put pressure on those companies to have zero emission energy doing it. And, geothermal is one of these base load energy sources. But if this is what matures this technology enough that we can start looking all over the world, anywhere where we have enough heat relatively close to the surface that we can use these drilling techniques to build reliable geothermal. And that's always been the problem. Not that geothermal was hard to do, that it wasn't reliable. That in many cases with new plants, within a year or two, the subterranean surface would shift and the plant would stop working and you had to drill again. The most expensive thing, you had to keep doing it.
Got it.
But shale technologies now helped us understand enough about rock bodies and drilling technique to be able to make more reliable wells.
Fantastic.
And so we can actually make power that way. Now, let me do a little blast of the past for you.
Okay.
Do you remember the super volcano episode back in 2018?
Oh, yeah.
Episode 1564. And that came from a paper I read from NASA Planetary Defense. Now, normally we think about NASA Planetary Defense around asteroid protection.
Asteroids,
right?
Yep.
The DART mission, that kind of thing. But this was a paper about how could humanity manage a supervolcano eruption? And then arguably the most important supervolcano, not the only one, but the important one is Yellowstone.
Yep.
And so one of the things they proposed was that you put geothermal power plants around the supervolcano caldera, because every time you take heat out of it, you decrease the risk of eruption.
What was that fancy word you used?
What's that?
Caldera?
Caldera? Yeah.
That's the rim, the edge?
So one of the things that supervolcano, in a traditional volcano, especially say a pyroclastic volcano, you have that cinder cone, the big cone that gets built up as it's erupting.
Yeah.
In more lava flow types like Mauna Kea, you have a very liquid lava, so you create a shield dome, different shapes. Supervolcanoes are so big, they can't make domes. As the bulge of magma builds up under the ground, what eventually happens is the ground collapses into it and then blasts outward. And that caldera, the hole that it will make, is many miles across.
Okay.
Most of the Yellowstone Park all of the thermal vents, all that sort of stuff is sitting in the Yellowstone volcano supervolcano caldera. So imagine.
We try not to think about it.
Well, look, volcanology is pretty advanced. These days, we are good at predicting volcanoes. We know when a volcano is coming. We can measure the small changes in the ground that show us that there's a possibility of an eruption coming. So imagine we're seeing an eruption, possible eruption coming of the Yellowstone volcano. And this is what NASA Planetary Defense was writing about, is the trick is to get the heat out. If we can take the heat out so the rock stays stronger, doesn't get too plasticized, we can stop the eruption. So you take these fracking techniques, you drill all around the caldera, and you pump water down to cool it. And while you're at it, you make electricity.
So it sounds like poking the bee's nest to me.
Well, without a doubt.
It has to be done right.
Yeah. The alternative was we just wait for the thing to go off and destroy the United States.
Well, that's not good.
You've got that as a known outcome.
It'd probably destroy Vancouver as well, wouldn't it?
Well, it'll go east, right? Like that's largely what would happen in that eruption. And we talked about this on the Supervolcano show. Is you'd take a multi-100-mile swath due east all the way to the seaboard, right? Like it would be bad.
It'd be quite bad.
The I-90, you're going to need one hell of a snowplow for that. Anyway.
All right. So getting back to this idea of putting fracking vents all around the caldera.
Yeah.
Is a good one.
Well, it's an interesting idea. It speaks to, again, skill sets we are developing as a civilization. But I'm equating it back to like the way that erosion of the Niagara Valley was controlled by generating electricity with hydroelectric. We've just had a couple of very serious eruptions in Iceland.
Yep.
And it's been happening over months. And there, by the way, there is a small hydroelectric plant nearby this current set of eruptions in Iceland. What if there were more?
Too small?
Well, no, I think it's very feasible. Like that plant by itself was already running. It had enough heat as it is, right? But could we get to a reaction time around this where we're starting to see ground disturbances and potential magma buildup? It's like, let's drop a few more drills in here and we'll make some more electricity and maybe we can cool this down. Like I'd want to experiment a lot with it, but just geothermal is not just a low emission base load power source. It also has some potential significant benefits for us directing volcanic behavior.
So now that you've scared our audience into thinking that the United States is going to blow up, what is the thought on when the big one will happen?
Well, that particular supervolcano, as we talked about back in that show in July of 2018, we have clear evidence of eruptions roughly every 600,000 years. There's been 3 different ones spaced about 600,000 years apart.
Wow.
And the last one was about 600,000 years ago.
Oh, geez. I remember now.
Don't worry about it. Yeah.
So we're due.
No.
No?
It doesn't really work that way.
No?
Okay. Let's go plus or minus 100,000 years.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that precise.
All right.
But yes, if you do the math that way, if you take a 3-point trend line and just draw it straight out, you're there. Is that actually a good way to do things? No.
Yeah.
Has the U.S. Geological Service instrumented the crap out of the Yellowstone caldera? You're damn right they have.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you're all paying attention.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
It's not going to happen anytime soon. There's no evidence of it at this particular point. But it is an interesting aspect of geothermal power. And I'm glad that we're advancing this way.
Yes.
Because, the ability to take more power offline quickly. What if instead of building a natural gas peaker plant, you built a geothermal plant instead?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it was the least expensive way to quickly build power. In 3 months, 4 months, a lot of these power plants, we're still talking years, many years, decades in some cases. And now you're talking weeks.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
The bummer would be if we built all these plants and then got used to that steady stream of power and then the whole thing blew up. Not only are we completely buried, but and probably the end of it, but now we lost our power sources as well. If we don't do it.
Yeah. But except that volcanoes come over time. So as it was coming, you could move things.
Yeah.
Like you'll have time to react. This isn't come out of the blue. This isn't a tornado. And even then you get some warning. This isn't even a hurricane. This is a volcano. It takes a while. And we can measure. We can see things coming.
It's not like one day, boom!
Yeah, exactly. Now, generally speaking, the reason we know so much about volcanic eruptions is that we get enough warning that we're able to see them coming and watch closely as they happen and then learn more.
Very good.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
The nuclear segment, as you expected, is large.
Yep.
And Carolyn McKay asked me on the social medias, it's like, hey, has you got anything new to say in the space? And I'm like, yeah, not going to talk much about the old stuff, but we'll talk about the new stuff.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So we've been talking about small modular reactors for many years.
Yeah.
And as of today, right now, at this moment, there's still exactly none. But progress is being made. So there were 2 projects that I was talking about last year and even the year before. One of them was the NuScale project, largely based in and around Idaho, but totally an American project. And that was to build 6 77 megawatt modular reactors, really quite small. So 6 together would be 462 megawatts, where, traditional light water reactors run in the 300 to 600 per, right? Really 600, even up to gigawatt per. So this was going to be quite small. And they made a deal in 2019 for $5 billion that would start making power in 2026. Then the pandemic hit. And then by 2023, so this year, that was now priced at 9.6, from 5.3 to 9.6, and now no start until 2029. And so where it was supposed to be about $55 per megawatt hour, which is reasonable, now it was closer to $89 per megawatt hour, which is unreasonable. And the project's been fully canceled. Yeah. And one of the arguments against it is that it was a bit too small, that 77 megawatt reactors are a little too small. Now, in general, what's great about small modular nuke is a couple of things. The first is the most dangerous thing about nuclear power is fuel handling.
Right.
And traditionally, in fact, exclusively, every reactor site handled its own fuel. So uranium's mined in Australia or Canada as a few locations. It's refined there into yellow cake. And then it is shipped to a factory. Typically, a Westinghouse would be the main ones. General Electric does this too, where they make it into fuel rods. Those fuel rods are then shipped to the power plant. The power plant handles its own fuel assembly. So it now takes those, they're little cylinders, maybe a couple, 2 or 3 inches long, inch across, and they stack them into bundles. And these are highly radioactive. They open up their reactors, they take a fuel rod assembly out, put it into a cooling pond, and then take a new assembly, put it into the reactor, button it all back up, pressurize it, go back to work. It's very standalone approach to doing things. It means that every site, because it has to handle fuels, has to qualify for all this complex work in handling radioactive materials. It's very difficult. It's costly, and it's one of the things that makes this kind of power so expensive. Is that each site is bespoke, unique in its ability to handle fuel for its reactors. The concept behind modular reactors is that you have a common site for manufacturing the reactor assemblies. It's the only thing that handles fuel. The production sites where you're actually going to make the electricity, they receive assembled reactors ready to run that are then placed with a crane into a container, typically a big concrete pool filled with water, hooked up to cooling and to the electrical grid and powered up. And they'll run 2 to 3 years. And at the end of those 2 to 3 years, you unhook them, you take the whole reactor back out, put it back on a truck, and ship it away. Now, is that a dangerous thing to do? Less dangerous than shipping fuel assemblies.
That's right, because it's self-contained.
Exactly.
Another thing I like about that is every 2 or 3 years, you get a chance to inspect everything and make sure that it's ready to accept another reactor.
Dude, upgrades.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of running a reactor for 30 years, every couple of years when you go to replace it, why would you replace it with the same one? Put a better one in.
Yep.
So you're on a much better upgrade cycle. If you have a problem with a given reactor, because it's a small reactor with modern designs, even if somehow it failed, it's still contained. So your site's not ruined. You can take that damaged reactor assembly out, ship it away, and continue to use the production site. There's one, then you have a central place away from people. Like you generally want to make your power close to people because they're the ones who want to use it, but you want to handle fuel away from people. And so you reprocess those reactors, and make new fueled ones, and then you send them back in to be used. And you can constantly rotate them, and you can improve them.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Right? That is the idea behind small modular, is to make the reactors routinely replaceable and to centralize fuel handling so we can put it in a place where the risks are low, tectonically safe, doesn't need to be near water, doesn't need to be near populations. Like these are the advantages. It's a good idea, and it has been maturing. So I told you the bad news first. That's the American Project NuScale. Here's the good news. GE Hitachi has a reactor they call the BWR X300. We talked about it last year. It's a 300 megawatt modular reactor. In Canada, in Ontario, when Ontario makes 80% of their electricity with nuclear power, but they largely do it with Canadian designed CANDU deuterium water reactors. They're a heavy water reactor instead of a light water reactor. So they use deuterium. And the main reason for that is that they don't need enriched uranium. Uranium enrichment is expensive, and it was originally developed in the Manhattan Project to make weapons,
to make bombs.
And light water reactors use that technology because one of the byproducts of fuel reprocessing was plutonium to make more bombs. Now, we don't need more bombs. We've not ever needed more bombs. And in France, who also largely makes all of their electricity from nuclear power, they now use that plutonium in their fuel rods and they burn it. That's not happening with American light water reactors for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, we talked about that before. In Canada, because we have no weapons programs, we did not want to enrich uranium, and so we developed reactors that didn't need to. But that being said, they still have all the same problems. They're a little bit more efficient than light water reactors, but they are expensive. And they are bespoke, and they do their own fuel handling. And they need large exclusion zones. And while we've never had a major accident, knock on wood, there's an easier way to go about it. So the Darlington reactor site is a retired CANDU reactor site. And they were trying to decide what to do with it. They still need to make electricity. They talked about putting in solar. They've tried a lot of different things, but they've come around to the modular reactor design. So the handling fuel site is going to be away from that. Darlington is right on the lake. Mm-hmm. They committed to a year ago putting in one of these reactors. They've now are through their second stage of certification. There's one more left to go. It's gone well enough now that they've now committed to putting in 4 reactors instead of 1.
Wow!
So they're on track for power in the next by 2029.
And I know we talked about this before, but just remind us, like, what did you say that? How many megawatts is this little power plant?
So these are 300 megawatt reactors. So 4 together.
300 megawatts.
Yeah.
So how many homes could that power?
I mean, now you're back to, it depends on the home.
Like a small town?
When you're talking about American homes and Canadian homes, very power consumptive homes, you get about 1,000 homes per megawatt, right? So these are 300 megawatt reactors, so you're talking about 3,000 homes times 4. So yeah, you're going to need more, but this is the experimentation, right? Is if this works, there's many more. In fact, because Ontario has been so successful, Saskatchewan is now identifying sites for the same reactor design.
Wow.
They wouldn't be online till the 2030s, but they're on that same path. Poland is going through the certification process with the same reactor as well.
Cool.
So there is now this sense of a race of who's got the most mature technology, who's the furthest down the path. There's lots of small reactor designs out there.
Yeah.
But for better or worse, GE Hitachi, who make conventional reactors too, now have matured this design to a point where we've now got holes in the ground where they're supposed to go. And we're going to actually make electricity for it, and they may get to win this one.
That's very cool.
It's good news, and it's
good news.
Progress, and the size matters. Like the argument here was that what was wrong with NuScale was 77 megawatts was too small. GE Hitachi, it's still truck portable at 300 megawatts. And now there's a company called ISMR that's talking about in that same form factor being able to make a thorium reactor. So you talk about that modular design.
That's sort of the holy grail.
Yeah. And Bob Archer, one of our regular listeners, pinged me about, can you talk about thorium? Is there anything to talk about? And again, I don't want to talk about old news. I want to talk about new news.
Yeah.
But there is new news in thorium.
Okay.
But primarily out of China. So this year, 2023, the Shanghai Institute has now certified for operation a thorium reactor in China.
Wow.
So in the Gobi Desert, in the northwest part of China, there is a experimental reactor site. Not a lot of water around, by the way. It's a tiny reactor, 2 megawatts. So really just a lab reactor. This is like the Oak Ridge Laboratory molten salt reactor of the 1960s was a 5 megawatts. So you get a sense this is really a small reactor. But according to the Shanghai Institute, it works well enough in tests that they said, why don't you just make electricity with it? Here's a 10-year permit. So they're going to be making 2 megawatts of electricity and getting operational practice with it. China is incentivized somewhat. While they have some uranium reserves, they have far more thorium reserves.
So would the holy grail for Richard Campbell be modular thorium reactors?
There's some interesting advantages. Now, it depends on how the assembly. You remember this from our thorium shows.
Barely.
There were 3 different things in motion there.
I remember the molten salts.
Yes. So one of them is molten salts. And understand, thorium, when used in a reactor, becomes uranium anyway. It's a different isotope of uranium, but it does become uranium. Right? It's actually, it has a decay product into uranium that actually generates the heat. So in the end, it's all uranium. The difference is the ore bodies. And in China, because they do a lot of rare earth extraction, there is a mineral called monzonite, which is where you get a lot of praseodymium and other rare earths, but its primary element in it is thorium. So the Chinese have a bunch of thorium in tailing piles from extracting rare earths, and they could process it into pure thorium and then combine it with lithium and beryllium and fluorine to make a salt that then can be run in a thermal blanket as part of a reactor assembly, where it'll get bombarded for neutrons to then become uranium-233, which then gets pumped through the main through the main graphite assembly and generates electricity. The other things to remember about molten salts is that because they're a fluid and they're only a liquid at 400 degrees centigrade plus, if anything you have this containment mechanism where as soon as you have a problem, you can drop them into a storage tank and then they cool down into a solid. They operate at 1 atmosphere of pressure. You don't need to pressurize them to get enough heat. In fact, most of the time you're dealing with too damn much heat. They're a liquid from 400 degrees centigrade to 1500 degrees centigrade, as opposed to water, which is only 0 to 100. So you have this huge liquid temperature operating range you can work in. And so the trick then is efficient ways to extract heat from that. Why? It's too hot for water. You need other extraction techniques. But molten salt reactors can run on regular uranium as well as on thorium. It doesn't really matter. So you can pick your fuel. This is mostly a technique, but it's a technique that has a lot of inherent safety in it. And even more importantly, you can incorporate into its operation a fuel reprocessing process. So when you're dealing with liquefied uranium, you can gasify it and separate it from the lower elements that it has, and then dehydrogenate it back into a liquid again. And so there's an ability as you break uranium into its constituent components. So you remember, you're bombarding these uranium atoms with neutrons. Most common reaction, not the only reaction, the most common reaction is you break them into cesium and iodine. Okay. They're radioactive flavors of cesium and iodine, but that's okay. They decay over weeks. And so if you can extract that cesium and iodine out of the fluid, you can, after a couple of months, have a non-radioactive sellable version of those elements.
Wow.
And so unlike in solid reactors where those same reactions damage the core, when you're operating in a fluid, you can keep processing the fuel until there's no fuel left. And so you can pretty much burn up all of the high actinides, all the radioactive components, and be left over with elements. So yeah, I like molten salt reactors because they get rid of the dangerous stuff in the process of making electricity with it. Maybe the route to making those is through modular reactors, but the really complex form with its own integrated breeder and fuel reprocessing is probably going to need its own form factor. But if we were going to build it, we probably would have by now. It's just too much risk. And we could manage a bunch of risk around thorium by maturing it in small reactor designs.
Good.
And in fact, there's a group in Copenhagen named Copenhagen Atomics, that has been developing a container-sized molten reactor. So this is the TEU, the industrial shipping container, 8 foot by 8 foot by 20 foot, typically double the length to a 40-foot container. So they've been trying to make a reactor that fits into that. That would work basically as a small modular reactor that you could drop off somewhere, power up, run it for a couple of years, and then replace it. And they're using a containerized model to make a demonstration 1 megawatt reactor by 2025. So still a bit speculative. They have a customer. That customer is Indonesia. Indonesia is a resource extraction country. They have a lot of mining projects that need electricity. Typically, those electricity is now delivered by diesel generators. Expensive way to go. You got to keep shipping diesel up to it. So the idea you could drop a container containing 1 megawatt electrical power plant in it to operate in a mine for a couple of years at a time, very efficient. Not a real product yet, but certainly on a path. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about fusion because there has not been much news about fusion. And why hasn't there been much news about fusion, Carl?
Because it's freaking hard.
Well, because they've got money.
Oh, because they've got money. Okay.
And they don't talk when they have money. That's right.
Yeah.
So the two of the fusion projects I talked about a fair bit last year, Commonwealth Fusion, which raised a couple of $1 billion off of Gates et al. Back in the day, have enough money literally to get to a pilot project they called Spark. They are still building that. And that reactor excites me a lot for a couple of reasons. The most important reason is that they are using REBCO superconductors. So this is the rare earth barium cupric oxide semiconductors that you cool with liquid nitrogen instead of liquid helium.
Oh, okay.
So they're a lot less expensive, and they make far more powerful fields than the niobium tin liquid helium cooled superconductive fields that are being used in ITER, the giant reactor in France that is soaked up tens of billions of dollars.
And still hasn't produced energy, right?
Isn't online to even light up. And based on calculations, will never be net power positive. Just learn a little more. It's a perfect system for building another reactor.
It's a perfect system for job security for a handful of people. Yeah.
And then the other one that we talked about last year was Helion, who raised $500 million plus in 2021.
Yeah.
One of their investors being, we didn't talk about this before, but might as well talk it now because one of their investors was Sam Altman.
No kidding.
Nobody knew his name a year ago, but they sure know it now.
Yep.
The most interesting piece of news, Helion's reactor design, and I mentioned this earlier, was the pulse reactor using magnetic coils, not only to make the fusion detonation, but also to collect it as energy. And Microsoft recently signed a memorandum of understanding, because they're based out of Western Washington, that they will buy electricity from Helion for their data centers as zero emission electricity.
Whatever happened to that crazy MCAT guy, that Italian guy?
Oh, God. Yeah, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proof, and he extraordinary failed.
Yeah.
He's gone.
But he tried to pull the wool over some people's eyes a couple of times.
He's not alone. Lots. It goes on all the time. Our friend Martina Grom almost emotionally wrote on Twitter to me about this. It's like, how can we be saved? I think she was feeling a little grim that day. Cheer up, Martina. It's bad, but it's not as bad as it could be. And it is getting better. We happen to be recording this shortly after COP28. So it's the UN's climate change meeting ended in Dubai. Backtrack to COP3. COP3 was in 1997. That was the one in Kyoto, Japan. And that led to the Kyoto Accords, the sort of first set of international documents, which many countries, excluding the United States, signed into starting to restrict emissions. And at that time, the projections were that we would raise the average temperature of the planet by 4.5 degrees by 2100. And then that would be catastrophic. And I just want to make a point to folks that, well, we're certainly not out of the woods. Like, that projection is now over. If we did nothing more in terms of changing our power generation and emissions around the world than we've done up till this point, we wouldn't hit 4.5 degrees.
That's good news, I guess.
We've lowered the number. Like, the argument is we're about a third of the way there. Like, in that 25 years between COP3 and COP28, we have made substantial strides. It's not enough, but it's not like it's futile. We're making some progress.
I know that I've just heard something recently, and I'm sorry I don't have the numbers and figures in my head because I don't remember things like you do, but there was some promise that the United States made to cut emissions by 50% by the year 2040, I'm thinking. And this was back in the early 2000s, and we've already gotten halfway there. We've cut by 25%.
And a lot of that is things like electric cars and retiring coal power plants. Even just switching to natural gas, because it became super cheap because of fracking. We got so much of it, and the process of getting a maximum electricity from it reduced the amount of carbon dioxide per megawatt substantially. Progress has been made. We just have to make more.
Right.
And I would argue that that a lot came out of COP28. I mean, the crazy part was at Dubai.
Yeah, right.
Right. Like, you're in an oil making, like, and by the way, if you don't think it's a big deal, look at how many people, how many lobbyists, how many interested parties descended on that 2 weeks in Dubai. Like, everybody was engaged, no two ways about it. And the current climate forecast, in 2023, we hit a record. We had one day this past year where the planet on average was 2 degrees above the baseline. It was a peak, and it's the largest ever recorded. The average is more like 1.4.
In the United States anyway, this July was the hottest July on record ever. Ever.
And I think when we get the numbers together, it'll be true for the whole year. And that, of course, keeps happening. In COP28, they talked about if we stick to our agreement by 2050, which sure looks like we won't, we're going to get to 1.7 as the average temperature, which is bad. It's got serious consequences. But the more important part was to just do that, to get to that point, we would decrease our average oil and gas consumption overall by about 45%. And so there was an argument that we've already peaked in consuming oil and gas. About 105 million barrels of oil used in a day. And we already know that the industry is avoiding putting on more refining because it takes a decade, it takes 25 years to get break even on a refinery. So they're not incented to add them because they see the writing on the wall. They certainly were there and fighting vociferously against it. If we were actually going to do the 1.5 degree increase from the Paris Accords for 2050, we need 75% less consumption than where we're at right now. Which on one hand seems impossible. On the other hand, I've just talked through a whole bunch of things we're doing that really open the door to more of that going on.
Yeah.
The production, transport, and processing of oil and gas produces about 5 billion tons of CO2 just last year, about 15% of all of the emissions. So one of the things that happens when you consume less oil is you decrease the amount of emissions necessary to get that oil to you, right, to actually create it. So there's quite a positive role there. And so one of the things that came out of COP28 was this idea that there's enough known oil sites on this planet right now to provide all of the oil and gas needed based on those projections for where we're supposed to be by 2050. And so there is no need for governments to subsidize long lead time extraction, which is the reality, of course, is that oil and gas industries extract trillions of dollars worth of subsidies to look for oil.
Yeah.
And so the argument, at COP was, you could take that money and put it towards more zero emission energy generation.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're just not going to, if we achieve these goals, you're just not going to need that long lead time stuff. This does not please the industry much.
Yeah.
Because it's not like the industry's ever going to go away. If we're to get to the 1.5 scenario in 2050, we go from needing 102 million barrels a day to needing about 24. And the most of that isn't burned. Most of that is lubricants, right? Like we're always going to need a certain amount of oil and gas. It's never going to go away, right? It's just, what do you make plastics from? Although hopefully you have recyclable plastic. What do you make lubricants from? Like all of those things to go into that. So, at 24 million barrels a day, only 75% will be used for something other than combustion.
Yeah.
And that was pretty exciting, right? A great combination. And herein lies the problem is that there's a reason why governments subsidize oil and gas extraction, because it's corrupting. And I would use the example of Petrobras in Brazil. I don't know if you remember the story, but back in 2007, there was big blast of news about they'd find huge oil reserves off the coast of Brazil. It's in pretty deep water. It was going to be a tricky extraction, but it was a huge amount of oil. And, Brazil was destined to be the new Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And Petrobras, which is the national oil company, of course, is working with, I believe it was BP on this particular project. And over the next decade, Petrobras got billions and billions in subsidized financing. And by 2015, it became apparent that everybody was on the take, that so much money was flowing around because it was going to be worth decades of oil income, that they were paying off everybody, all the way to Lula da Silva himself, to the president of Brazil. And that led to the collapse of the government and a big crisis in Petrobras. And Bolsonaro came out of that. Like, the side effect of this much money is some bad behavior.
And one can only look to Russia to see an ongoing example of that, right? I mean, it's the oil, it's a petrostate. Yeah.
Well, they're primarily a petrostate, for better or worse. Yeah. So we know the effects of when this much money comes into play around these kinds of technologies. And it's one of the reasons that they're continuing as well as they have. And at the same time, we have these options, these new projections, these new ability to build other energy sources that can give us options. So how can we be saved? Keep doing what you're doing. I really want to pass the message on. It's like, it's not for naught.
Yeah.
Like, we are making success. You can work at if you're the kind of person who can handle government level, if you want to protest, do it, right? If you want to keep to yourself on it more, just emitting less, it makes a difference. It's worth. And does that mean getting an electric vehicle or switching to transit? Sure. Right. Putting solar on your roof, going to heat pump heat instead of a gas furnace. Yeah. All of those things are making a difference. They are making progress. More needs to be done. Can we be saved? We're probably going to make it. It's just a question of how many people die unnecessarily.
Yeah.
That's only really the question we're tackling. Millions have already died. You look at most of the conflicts around the world right now, they generally start with a crop failure. The Syrian civil war started with a crop failure and a tripling of the price of bread. That makes people angry when they can't feed their family, that they're willing to do really dangerous, life-threatening things, like fighting against their government with violence. Mm-hmm. Libya, too, that government didn't survive. Now you've got a failed state. Heck, all of Arab Spring started with food prices, really. Wow. In Myanmar, there was a rice crop failure. And then a group of people blamed a minority group called the Rohingya and persecuted them. And now it's a genocide. And the Rohingya have had to flee Myanmar into other countries. Like, the environmental disasters that are killing people, they're going on now, and they're only going to get worse. We get to choose how much worse it gets. We can work on this. The side effect of reducing emissions and reducing these impacts, decreasing the overall heat on the planet, will mean more reliable food. And reliable food makes for happy people. Happy people don't fight. Frightened people fight.
Well said.
We are going to reduce fear if we can reduce emissions.
Well said, Mr. Campbell.
Thank you.
Sounds like parting words.
Hey, it's going to be a good year.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate the research that you do, and especially the human touch that you brought there at the end. That's a very important message. So, everybody, Happy New Year, and we'll see you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and, of course, in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time.